Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the sterile conference room, her navy dress uniform crisp and perfectly pressed. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the mahogany table where three men in expensive suits sat reviewing her file. Behind them, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the Pentagon's courtyard, but Sarah's eyes remained fixed straight ahead. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, the middle-aged man with silver hair, began, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "I'm Director James Harrison from the Office of Naval Intelligence. These are my colleagues, Agent Thompson and Agent Clark from Internal Affairs." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Internal Affairs. She'd been expecting this meeting for weeks, ever since the mission in Syria had gone sideways. The mission that had saved 12 American hostages, but had also resulted in questions about her methods. "Ma'am," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in her chest. Director Harrison opened a thick manila folder, photographs spilling slightly from its edges. Sarah caught glimpses of surveillance images, tactical reports, and what looked like medical examiner photos. Her stomach clenched, but her expression remained neutral. "We need to discuss Operation Desert Falcon," Harrison continued, his tone clinical and detached. "Specifically, your actions on the night of October 15th. Sarah's mind flashed back to that night. The cramped, sweltering safe house in Aleppo. The smell of dust and fear. The sound of her team member, Rodriguez, whimpering as enemy combatants tortured him in the next room. The impossible choice she'd had to make. "Sir, my after-action report details everything that occurred during the mission," Sarah said, her hands clasped behind her back. Agent Thompson, a thin man with cold blue eyes, leaned forward. "Your report mentions the use of enhanced interrogation techniques on a captured enemy combatant. We need specifics, Commander." The euphemism hung in the air like smoke. "Enhanced interrogation technique." As if there were gentle ways to extract information from terrorists who had just finished waterboarding her teammate. "I followed Navy SEAL protocols for information extraction in hostile territory," Sarah replied. "The subject possessed critical intelligence about the location of American hostages. Time was a factor." Agent Clark, who had remained silent until now, pulled out a tablet and swiped through what appeared to be video footage. "We have security camera footage from the compound, Commander. Would you like to review it with us?" Sarah's pulse quickened, but she kept her breathing steady. She'd been trained for this. Months of SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape had prepared her for hostile interrogations. She just hadn't expected the hostility to come from her own people. "That won't be necessary, sir. I stand by my actions and my report." Director Harrison removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture Sarah recognized as calculated intimidation. "Commander Martinez, you've had an exemplary career. Top of your class at the Naval Academy. First woman to complete SEAL training in under 18 months. Decorated combat veteran with 3 tours in Afghanistan. Each accolade felt like a small cut. She knew what came next. But that would erase 15 years of service and sacrifice. But Harrison continued right on cue. "This incident raises serious questions about your judgment and adherence to the Geneva Convention." Sarah felt heat rising in her chest. The Geneva Convention. These desk jockeys in their climate-controlled offices wanted to lecture her about the Geneva Convention, while Rodriguez still woke up screaming every night from what those animals had done to him. "Sir, with respect, the enemy combatants we engaged had already violated every article of the Geneva Convention. They were torturing American servicemen. I did what was necessary to save lives." Agent Thompson's lips curved into what might have been a smile, but his eyes remained cold. "What was necessary? That's an interesting phrase, Commander. Tell us, what exactly did you deem necessary that night?" Sarah's mind raced. She could see where this was heading. They wanted details. They wanted her to incriminate herself, to give them the ammunition they needed to end her career. But she also knew that 12 American fathers had gone home to their families because of what she'd done in that compound. "I used standard interrogation techniques appropriate for the tactical situation," she said carefully. "Standard?" Agent Clark looked up from his tablet. "Waterboarding is standard." The word hit the room like a gunshot. Sarah felt her carefully constructed composure crack slightly. They knew. Of course they knew. The question was whether they had enough evidence to prove it. "I used techniques that resulted in actionable intelligence that led to the successful recovery of 12 American hostages," Sarah said, her voice harder now. Director Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Commander, We're going to need more than tactical justifications. The Secretary of the Navy is facing pressure from Congress about this incident. There are senators calling for investigations into SEAL operations overseas. Political pressure. That's what this was really about. Sarah felt a familiar anger building in her gut. The same anger that had sustained her through Hell Week, through the months of brutal training that had nearly broken her body and spirit. The anger that came from being held to different standards, from having to prove herself over and over again in a world that never quite believed she belonged. "What exactly are you asking me to do, sir?" Sarah asked. The three men exchanged glances. Agent Thompson pulled out a legal document and slid it across the table. "We're offering you an honorable discharge with full benefits. Retire quietly, and this investigation disappears. Continue your consulting work, write your book, live your life." Sarah stared down at the papers without touching them. 15 years. 15 years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice. 15 years of proving that she could do anything her male counterparts could do, often better. And now they wanted her to just walk away. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Director Harrison's expression hardened. "Then, we proceed with a formal investigation. Court-martial proceedings. The media attention that comes with that. Your entire career scrutinized under a microscope." The threat was clear. Take the easy way out, or have everything she'd worked for destroyed publicly. Sarah thought about her father, a retired Marine colonel, who had warned her about this exact scenario. "The military will use you up and spit you out the moment you become inconvenient," he'd said. She'd never believed him. Until now. "I need time to consider this," Sarah said. "You have until tomorrow morning," Agent Thompson replied. "Oh, and, Commander? This conversation is classified. Discussing it with anyone, including your attorney, would constitute a breach of national security." Even her right to legal counsel was being stripped away. Sarah felt the walls of the room closing in around her. This wasn't justice. This was a cover-up, plain and simple. "Is there anything else, gentlemen?" Sarah asked. Director Harrison stood, and the others followed suit. "Just one more thing, Commander. We're going to need your security clearance badge and weapon. Standard procedure during an investigation." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to the Sig Sauer P-226 at her hip. The same weapon that had saved her life countless times in combat. The physical symbol of her authority and capability. "Sir, I'm still an active duty officer. Not for much longer," Agent Clark interrupted. "Badge and weapon, please." The humiliation was deliberate. They wanted her to feel powerless, to understand that her years of service meant nothing when weighed against political expediency. Sarah slowly unholstered her weapon, checked to ensure it was safe, and placed it on the table. Her security badge followed. "Thank you, Commander. Someone will escort you out." As if she were a security threat. As if she might steal state secrets or assault Pentagon personnel. Sarah straightened her uniform jacket and moved toward the door. "Commander," Director Harrison called after her. "For what it's worth, I believe you're a good soldier. But sometimes good soldiers have to fall on their swords for the greater good." Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the handle. For the greater good. She'd heard that phrase before, usually right before someone asked her to do something that benefited everyone except her. "Sir," she said without turning around, "I've spent my entire career falling on sword for the greater good. Maybe it's time someone else took a turn." She walked out of the conference room with her head high, but inside, she felt something breaking. Not her resolve, but her faith. Faith in the system she'd served so loyally. Faith in the idea that doing the right thing would be rewarded rather than punished. The escort, a young Marine corporal who couldn't have been more than 20, walked beside her in uncomfortable silence. Sarah could see the questions in his eyes, the confusion about why a decorated officer was being treated like a criminal. She wanted to tell him to pay attention, to learn from what he was witnessing, but she held her tongue. Outside the Pentagon, the October air was crisp and clean. Sarah stood on the steps, looking out at the Potomac River in the distance. Somewhere across that river, Rodriguez was probably in another therapy session, trying to piece together his shattered mind. The other members of her team were deployed somewhere in the Middle East, still fighting the good fight. And she was here being offered a choice between professional suicide and actual suicide. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister Maria. "Dinner Sunday?" The kids missed their Aunt Sarah. Sarah stared at the message, thinking about her niece and nephew, 8 and 6 years old, respectively. They saw her as a hero, always begging for stories about her adventures. What would she tell them when they asked why she wasn't in uniform anymore? Another text, this one from her father. How did the meeting go? He knew. Somehow, he always knew when she was facing something difficult. It was a gift that came from 30 years in the Marines, from understanding how the military machine really worked. Sarah typed back, about as expected. Can we talk tonight? His response came immediately, always. I'll have the good scotch ready. The good scotch. That was their code for serious conversations, the kind that required liquid courage and absolute honesty. Sarah pocketed her phone and walked toward her car, a modest Honda Civic that looked out of place among the SUVs and luxury sedans in the Pentagon parking lot. As she drove through the Virginia countryside toward her small apartment in Arlington, Sarah's mind wandered back to the beginning, to that day 18 years ago when she'd first walked onto the grounds of the Naval Academy. She'd been so young, so idealistic, so certain that merit and dedication would be enough. Her father had tried to prepare her for the reality of military life as a woman. The subtle discrimination, the constant need to prove herself, the way her achievements would be minimized while her failures were magnified. But she'd been determined to prove him wrong, to show that the military had evolved, that it truly was a meritocracy. Now, sitting in traffic on I-395, she wondered if she'd just been naive. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed Rodriguez M. Sarah hesitated before answering. Rodriguez had been struggling since Syria, and their last conversation had been difficult. He blamed himself for getting captured, even though Sarah had told him repeatedly that it wasn't his fault. Hey, Mike, she answered. Sarah. His voice was rough, like he'd been drinking. I heard about the meeting today. News traveled fast in the special operations community. Sarah wasn't surprised that Rodriguez already knew, but she wondered who had told him. It went about how you'd expect, she said carefully, mindful that their conversation was probably being monitored. This is because of me, isn't it? Because of what happened to me. Sarah's heart clenched. The guilt in his voice was palpable, and she knew it was eating him alive. Mike, this has nothing to do with you. This is about politics and public relations. Bullshit. The word came out sharp and bitter. If I hadn't gotten myself captured, you wouldn't have had to stop. Sarah's voice was firm. You didn't get yourself captured. You were doing your job, and the enemy got lucky. What happened to you was not your fault. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of Rodriguez's labored breathing. They want me to testify, he said finally. Sarah's blood ran cold. What? Internal affairs. They want me to testify about what you did to get information out of that guy. About the interrogation. The betrayal hit Sarah like a physical blow. They weren't just going after her career. They were using her own teammate against her. A teammate who was still struggling with PTSD, who was vulnerable and easily manipulated. Mike, you don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with, Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice steady. They said if I don't cooperate, they'll investigate the circumstances of my capture. They think maybe I revealed classified information under torture. The bastards. They were threatening Rodriguez, using his own trauma against him. Sarah felt rage building her chest, white-hot and barely contained. Mike, listen to me, she said. Get a lawyer. Don't say anything else to anyone until you have legal representation. Do you understand? I can't afford a lawyer, Sarah. And they said this is classified anyway, that a civilian attorney couldn't help. More lies, more manipulation. Sarah gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. I'll help you find representation, she said. There are military lawyers who specialize in this kind of thing. What if they're right? Rodriguez's voice was barely a whisper now. What if I did break under torture? What if I gave him information that could have gotten people killed? Sarah wanted to reach through the phone and shake him. You didn't break, Mike. You held out for 18 hours against trained interrogators. That's longer than most people could last. And the only reason we found you was because of intel we gathered independently. It wasn't entirely true. Some of the intelligence that had led them to Rodriguez had come from the enemy combatant Sarah had interrogated. But Rodriguez didn't need to know that right now. I keep having nightmares, Rodriguez said. I wake up thinking I'm still there, still tied to that chair. Sarah's heart broke for him. Rodriguez had been one of the strongest, most capable operators she'd ever worked with. Seeing him reduced to this was almost unbearable. Have you been going to your sessions? She asked. Yeah, but they don't help. The shrink keeps asking me questions about the mission, about what I remember. Sometimes I think he's working for internal affairs, too. Paranoia was a common symptom of PTSD, but in this case, Rodriguez might not be wrong. The military had a history of using medical sessions to gather information for investigations. Mike, I want you to do something for me, Sarah said. I want you to call my father. You remember Colonel Martinez, right? Yeah, I remember him. He can help you navigate this. He knows people, knows how the system works. Will you call him? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, what you did for me that night, what you did to get information about where I was being held. Mike, I just want you to know that I don't care what they say about it. You saved my life. You and the team risked everything to get me back. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. We don't leave anyone behind, she said. You know that. I know. But not everyone would have gone as far as you did. The line went quiet again, and Sarah could hear Rodriguez struggling with his emotions. Promise me something, he said finally. What? Promise me you won't let them destroy you over this. You're the best operator I've ever served with, and the military needs people like you. Sarah couldn't promise that. She couldn't promise anything anymore. But Rodriguez needed to hear it. I promise, she lied. After Rodriguez hung up, Sarah sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment complex, staring at the building she'd called home for the past 3 years. It was a modest place, barely furnished, the kind of temporary living situation that suited someone who was always deployed somewhere else. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she didn't recognize. Commander Martinez? The voice was female, professional. Yes. This is Dana Walsh from the Washington Post. I was hoping we could talk about Operation Desert Falcon. Sarah's blood turned to ice. The media, they were already circling like vultures. I have no comment, Sarah said. Commander, I understand you might be facing disciplinary action related to the mission. I'd like to give you a chance to tell your side of the story. I said no comment. What about the allegations of torture? Do you deny that enhanced interrogation techniques were used? Sarah ended the call and immediately dialed her father's number. He answered on the first ring. I was wondering when you'd call, Colonel Martinez said. How bad is it? Bad, Sarah admitted. They want me to take an honorable discharge and disappear quietly. And if you don't, court-martial, public investigation, media circus. Her father was quiet for a moment. Sarah could picture him in his study, surrounded by military memorabilia and photographs from his own long career. What did you do over there, Mija? He asked gently. Sarah closed her eyes. Her father was one of the few people in the world she could tell the truth to. What I had to do, she said. Rodriguez was being tortured. They had information about other hostages. I did what was necessary to save American lives. How unnecessary? The question hung in the air between them. Her father wasn't asking for details. He was asking whether she could live with whatever she'd done. Necessary enough that I'd do it again, Sarah said. Then, we fight, Colonel Martinez said without hesitation. We fight because if they can do this to you, they can do it to any soldier who makes hard choices in impossible situations. Dad, they have video. Witness testimony. I could lose everything. You could lose everything by giving up too. At least if you fight, you go down swinging. Sarah laughed despite herself. It was such a typical response from her father, who had never backed down from a fight in his life. I'm scared, she admitted. Good, he said. Fear keeps you sharp. But don't let it keep you from doing what's right. What if I don't know what's right anymore? Then you trust your training and your instincts. You're a Martinez, Mija. We don't quit. After hanging up with her father, Sarah sat in the gathering darkness and thought about the choice ahead of her. She could take the easy path, retire quietly with her benefits intact, and spend the rest of her life wondering what if. Or she could fight a system that seemed determined to destroy her, knowing that the odds were stacked against her. Her phone buzzed one more time. Another unknown number. Commander Martinez, this is Attorney Rebecca Chun. I specialize in military law, particularly cases involving special operations personnel. I believe we should talk. Sarah hesitated. How did you get this number? Your father gave it to me. He thought you might need legal representation. Of course he had. Colonel Martinez never waited for problems to solve themselves. I'm not sure I can afford. My retainer is $1. Attorney Chun interrupted. After that, we work out payment based on your situation. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? Sarah looked up at her apartment building, at the life she'd built around military service. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to fight for that life or walk away from it forever. Yes, she said. I'll be there. As she walked toward her building, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. The helplessness and despair from earlier were being replaced by something else. Determination, anger, the fighting spirit that had carried her through SEAL training and 3 combat deployments. They wanted her to go quietly. They wanted her to disappear without a fight, to let them sweep this whole mess under the rug while Rodriguez continued to suffer, and other operators wondered if they'd be next. But Sarah Martinez had never been good at doing what people wanted her to do. She had until morning to make her choice, but deep down, she already knew what it would be. She was going to fight. Sarah arrived at Rebecca Chen's office at precisely 0800 hours, military punctuality ingrained in every fiber of her being. The law firm occupied the 15th floor of a glass building in downtown D.C., with a view that stretched across the city to the Capitol Dome. Sarah had traded her uniform for civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a navy blazer, but she still carried herself like the warrior she was. Attorney Chun was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps mid-30s, with sharp intelligence radiating from her dark eyes. Her office walls were lined with commendations and photographs showing her with various military personnel, including what looked like a group photo with several Medal of Honor recipients. "Commander Martinez," Chun said, standing to shake hands. "Please sit down. Coffee." "Black, thank you." Sarah settled into the leather chair across from Chen's desk, noting the attorney's firm handshake and direct eye contact. "Good signs." Chun poured coffee from a silver service set, a touch of elegance that seemed at odds with her direct manner. "Your father spoke highly of you when he called last night. 30-year Marine veteran, isn't he?" "Yes, ma'am. Retired colonel. He's worried about you." Chun handed Sarah the coffee and returned to her seat. "He's also furious about how this case is being handled." Sarah took a sip of coffee, surprised by its quality. "What did he tell you?" "Enough to know that you're being railroaded." Chun opened a legal pad and picked up her pen. "Now, I need you to tell me everything. And I mean everything. No military stoicism, no edited versions for my delicate civilian sensibilities. I need the truth if I'm going to help you." Sarah had been dreading this moment, the point where she would have to relive that night in Syria in explicit detail. But, looking at Chen's serious expression, she knew there was no alternative. "The mission was a hostage rescue," Sarah began. 12 American contractors had been taken by a group calling itself the Syrian Liberation Army. Intelligence suggested they were being held in a compound outside Aleppo. Chun made notes as Sarah spoke, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just listening. "My team consisted of 6 operators. We infiltrated the compound at 0200 local time. The plan was simple: fast insertion, locate the hostages, extract safely." "What went wrong?" Sarah set down her coffee cup, her hands suddenly needing something to do. "Everything. The intelligence was faulty. The compound was larger than we'd been told, with more guards than expected. And it was a trap." The memories came flooding back. The sound of automatic weapons fire erupting as they breached the outer wall. The sight of Rodriguez disappearing around a corner in pursuit of what they thought was a fleeing guard. The radio silence that followed. Rodriguez went missing about 15 minutes into the operation. We could hear gunfire from his position, then nothing. When we reached his last known location, there was blood but no body. "You continued the mission?" Sarah nodded. "Our orders were clear. The hostages took priority. We had reason to believe they would be executed at dawn." That was the part that still haunted her. The choice between searching for Rodriguez and completing the mission. In the moment, it had seemed clear-cut. 12 lives versus 1. But, lying awake at night, she wondered if she'd made the right call. "We located the hostages in the main building," Sarah continued. "They were in bad shape. Dehydrated, beaten, clearly traumatized. But alive. And Rodriguez?" We heard screaming from another building. Unmistakably his voice. Sarah's jaw tightened. The bastards were torturing him for information. Location of our base, mission parameters, planned extraction routes. Chun looked up from her notes. "How long did the torture continue?" "About an hour. We couldn't reach him without compromising the hostage rescue. And we couldn't extract the hostages while he was still captive. The hour that it felt like a lifetime." Listening to Rodriguez's screams while Sarah organized the hostage extraction, knowing that every minute of delay increased the risk to everyone involved. "Then we caught a break," Sarah said. "A guard got careless. Ventured too far from the main group. We took him alive." "The man you interrogated?" Sarah met Chen's eyes steadily. "Yes. Tell me about that interrogation." This was it. The moment of truth. Sarah could sanitize the story, make it sound clinical and professional. Or she could tell the truth and trust that Chun would understand the impossible position she'd been in. His name was Khalil Hassan. Mid-20s, Syrian national, been with the group for about 2 years, according to the intelligence we gathered later. He knew where Rodriguez was being held and what information they were trying to extract. How did you know he had this information? He told us. He was proud of it. Brag about the American soldier they'd captured, about what they were going to do to him. Sarah could still see Hassan's face, the cruel satisfaction in his eyes as he described Rodriguez's suffering. The complete lack of remorse or humanity. I started with standard techniques, Sarah continued. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, psychological pressure. But we didn't have time for a prolonged interrogation. So you escalated. The clinical term didn't capture the reality of what had happened. Sarah had crossed lines that night that she'd never imagined crossing, driven by desperation and the sound of her teammates' screams echoing across the compound. I used waterboarding, Sarah said quietly. 3 sessions, approximately 5 minutes each. She didn't flinch or show shock. She simply made a note and continued. Did it work? Hassan gave us the layout of the building where Rodriguez was being held. Guard positions, entry points, the location of the torture chamber. Information that allowed us to plan a successful extraction. Anything else? Sarah hesitated. There was more, details that made her stomach churn even now. Hassan also revealed that the group was planning to execute the hostages at 0600 hours. We thought we had until dawn, but we actually had less than 2 hours. So the information you obtained saved lives. 15 lives, Sarah confirmed. Rodriguez and the 12 hostages. Chun set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. Commander, what I'm about to ask you is important. Do you believe what you did was morally justified? The question Sarah had been asking herself every night since Syria. She'd run through endless scenarios in her mind, wondering if there had been another way, if she could have saved everyone without resorting to torture. I believe I made the best decision I could with the information available at the time, Sarah said carefully. That's not what I asked. Chen's directness was unsettling. Sarah was used to military conversations where subtext mattered more than direct statements. I believe that in extraordinary circumstances, actions that would normally be unthinkable become necessary to preserve human life, Sarah said finally. And you believe this was such a circumstance? Yes. Chen picked up her pen again. Good. Because if you didn't believe that, I couldn't represent you effectively. The statement surprised Sarah. Why? Because half of defending you is going to be convincing a military tribunal that you acted reasonably under extreme duress. If you don't believe that yourself, it becomes much harder to argue. Sarah felt a small measure of relief. After months of second-guessing herself, it was validating to hear a legal professional suggest that her actions might be defensible. What were we up against? Sarah asked. Chen pulled out a thick file folder. I've been making calls since your father contacted me last night. The charges they're considering include violation of the Geneva Convention, conduct unbecoming an officer, and assault. Assault? The waterboarding. Legally speaking, it constitutes assault under military law, regardless of the circumstances. Sarah felt her heart sink. What's the potential sentence? If they pursue the maximum penalties? Dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and up to 10 years in military prison. 10 years. Sarah tried to imagine herself at 45, released from prison with no career prospects and a criminal record. The future she'd worked so hard to build crumbling into nothing. But Chun continued, that's assuming they can prove their case and that we don't mount an effective defense. I think we can do better than that. What's our strategy? Chun opened the file and pulled out several documents. We have multiple angles of attack. First, necessity defense. You acted to prevent imminent harm to multiple American lives. Second, superior orders. You are operating under standing orders to use all necessary means to complete the mission. I wasn't specifically ordered to use waterboarding. No, but you were given broad discretion to use whatever means necessary. The key is establishing that a reasonable person in your position would have made the same choice. Sarah nodded, following the logic. What else? We challenged the evidence. The video they have is classified, which limits how they can use it in a public trial. We argue that your actions were within the bounds of SEAL training and protocol. Is that true? Chen's expression grew serious. That's complicated. Officially, waterboarding is prohibited. Unofficially, it's covered in advanced interrogation training as a technique of last resort. Sarah remembered the training conducted in a nondescript facility in North Carolina. The instructors had been clear that certain techniques were to be used only in extreme circumstances and only when authorized by higher command. But the authorization process could take hours or days, time that hadn't been available in Syria. There's another issue, Chen continued. Rodriguez's testimony. Internal Affairs is pressuring him to testify against you. I know. He called me yesterday. What's his mental state? Sarah considered the question carefully. Fragile. He's dealing with severe PTSD from the torture. He feels guilty about being captured, and now he's being manipulated by people who should be helping him. Could he be convinced to testify in your favor instead? Maybe, but I won't pressure him. He's been through enough. She made another note. Admirable, but potentially problematic. His testimony could be crucial either way. Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Director Harrison's name appeared on the screen. Should I answer? Sarah asked. Chen nodded. Put on speaker. Sarah accepted the call. Commander Martinez. Commander, this is Director Harrison. Have you had time to consider our offer? Sarah looked at Chen, who nodded encouragingly. I have, and I decline. I'll be fighting these charges with legal representation. Silence stretched on the other end of the line. When Harrison spoke again, his voice was cold. I'm disappointed, Commander. You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be. I'm making it exactly as difficult as it should be, Sarah replied. Very well. Formal charges will be filed this afternoon. You'll be notified through proper channels. The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, knowing she'd just crossed a point of no return. How do you feel? Chen asked. Terrified, Sarah admitted, but also relieved. I was tired of feeling like a victim. Chen smiled for the first time since Sarah had arrived. Good, because we have a lot of work to do. Over the next several hours, Chen walked Sarah through the legal process they were about to face. Military justice was different from civilian law in significant ways, with different rules of evidence and different standards for conviction. The prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed the acts you're charged with and that those acts were illegal under military law, Chen explained. Our job is to create reasonable doubt and to establish that your actions were justified. What about public opinion? That's tricky. On one hand, you'll have support from the military community and from people who understand the realities of combat. On the other hand, torture is deeply unpopular with the general public, regardless of circumstances. Sarah nodded, understanding the complexity. The American public wanted their military to be both effective and morally pure, often without understanding that those two requirements sometimes conflicted. There's something else we need to discuss, Chen said. Your personal life. The prosecution will try to paint you as someone who enjoys violence, who is looking for an excuse to use extreme methods. That's not true. I believe you. But they'll look at your entire career, your training records, any incidents that might suggest a pattern of aggressive behavior. Sarah thought about her career, tried to remember any incidents that could be taken out of context. I've never had any disciplinary issues. A few bar fights during leave, but nothing serious. Good. What about relationships? Anyone who might testify to your character. My team respects me. My commanding officers have given me excellent evaluations. I mean personal relationships. Romantic partners, close friends outside the military. The question highlighted something Sarah had been trying not to think about. Her dedication to her career had left little room for personal relationships. She'd had a few brief romances over the years, but nothing that had lasted beyond a deployment or transfer. Not really, Sarah admitted. The military has been my life. Chen's expression softened slightly. That's going to be a problem. The prosecution will argue that you're a lonely, career-obsessed officer who used excessive force because you had nothing to lose. That's not who I am. I know, but perceptions matter in a court-martial. We need to humanize you, show the jury that you're more than just a soldier. Sarah felt frustrated. After years of being told that her personal life was secondary to her military duties, she was now being told that her lack of personal connections could destroy her career. What do you suggest? We need character witnesses. People who can speak to your humanity, your compassion, your moral compass. Family members, perhaps. Sarah thought about her family. Her parents, her sister Maria, and her children. They would support her, but dragging them into this mess felt wrong. My father will testify, Sarah said. He understands this world. Good. Anyone else? Maybe some of my former teammates. People I've served with over the years. She made notes. We'll need to be careful about that. Some of them might be reluctant to get involved in a controversial case. As if on cue, Sarah's phone rang again. This time, it was Master Chief Petty Officer James Sullivan, her former team leader from Afghanistan. Sarah, Sullivan's gravelly voice filled the office. I just heard about the charges. This is bullshit. Thanks, Sully. It's good to hear from you. Listen, I don't know all the details of what happened in Syria, but I know you. You're one of the most ethical officers I've ever served under. If you did what they say you did, you had good reason. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Sullivan's support meant more than he could know. I appreciate that. What do you need? How can I help? Sarah looked at Chun, who nodded encouragingly. Would you be willing to testify as a character witness? Damn right I would. You saved my ass more times than I can count. Time for me to return the favor. After hanging up with Sullivan, Sarah felt a surge of hope. Maybe she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. That's excellent, Chun said. Military personnel testifying on your behalf carries a lot of weight with a court-martial panel. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from her sister Maria. Saw the news. Kids are asking questions. Call me. The news. Sarah's stomach dropped. It's already public? Chun was already pulling up news websites on her computer. Washington Post has the story. Navy SEAL commander charged with torture in Syria mission. The reporter you hung up on yesterday. Sarah scanned the article, her heart sinking with each paragraph. The story painted her as a rogue operator who had gone too far, emphasizing the torture allegations while barely mentioning the successful rescue of hostages. This is a disaster, Sarah said. It's a setback, Chun corrected, but not fatal. We'll issue a statement defending your actions and requesting that people wait for all the facts to come out. Sarah's phone started ringing almost immediately. Unknown numbers, probably more reporters. She let the go to voicemail. How do I face my family? Sarah asked. How do I explain this to my niece and nephew? Chen's expression was sympathetic. You tell them the truth in age-appropriate terms. You tell them that sometimes adults have to make very difficult choices to protect people. What if I'm convicted? What if they remember me as the aunt who went to prison for torture? Then you deal with that when it happens. Right now, you focus on fighting these charges and proving your innocence. Sarah nodded, trying to summon the same determination that had carried her through SEAL training. But this felt different. In training, she'd known that success was possible through hard work and perseverance. Here, so many factors were beyond her control. What happens next? Sarah asked. Formal charges will be filed today. You'll be assigned a preliminary hearing date, probably within the next 2 weeks. We use that time to examine the evidence and build our defense. Will I be arrested? No. You'll remain free pending trial. But you'll probably be suspended from active duty. The thought of being benched while this played out was almost worse than the possibility of prison. Sarah had defined herself through action, through mission accomplishment. Sitting on the sidelines felt like a slow death. Commander, Chun said gently, I need you to prepare yourself for the possibility that this gets worse before it gets better. The media attention, the political pressure, the stress on your family, it's all going to intensify. Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where political careers were made and destroyed daily. Somewhere in those buildings, powerful people were deciding whether she was a hero or a war criminal. What would you do? Sarah asked. If you were in my position? Chun was quiet for a long moment. I'd fight, she said finally. Because someone has to. Because if we don't draw a line here, the next soldier who makes a hard choice in an impossible situation will face the same persecution. Sarah turned back to face her attorney. Then we fight. Good. But, Sarah, Chen's use of her first name was deliberate. You need to understand that fighting means accepting the risk of total destruction. If we lose, you lose everything. Your career, your benefits, your freedom, your reputation. And if we win, you get your life back. And maybe, just maybe, you prevent this from happening to someone else. Sarah thought about Rodriguez, about the other members of her team still deployed around the world, about the young sailors and Marines who were watching this case, and wondering if their own government would turn on them if they made hard choices in combat. When do we start? Sarah asked. Chun smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. We already have. The rest of the afternoon was spent in preparation. Chen's staff began reaching out to potential witnesses, while Sarah provided detailed timelines and documentation of everything that had happened in Syria. It was exhausting work, reliving the worst night of her career in excruciating detail. As evening approached, Sarah finally called her sister back. Maria, it's me. Sarah, thank God. Are you okay? The kids saw the news, and they're confused. Sarah could hear her nephew's voice in the background, asking if Aunt Sarah was in trouble. "I'm okay," Sarah said. "It's complicated, but I'm okay." "What really happened over there?" Sarah looked at Chun, who nodded. "I did what I had to do to save American lives. Now some people think I went too far." "Did you?" The question hung in the air. Sarah thought about Hassan, about the information that had saved 15 lives, about the moral complexity of a situation that couldn't be reduced to simple right and wrong. "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "But I'd do it again." Maria was quiet for a moment. Then, "I support you," she said finally. "We all do. Mom and Dad are flying in tomorrow." "You don't have to." "Yes, we do. You're family. We stick together." After hanging up, Sarah sat in Chen's office as the sun set over Washington. Tomorrow would bring formal charges, media scrutiny, and the beginning of a legal battle that could destroy her life. But tonight, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. She wasn't fighting this alone anymore. "Ready to go home?" Chen asked, packing up files. Sarah stood and gathered her things. "Actually, I think I'll walk. I need some air." "Be careful. There might be reporters waiting outside your building." Sarah nodded and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed, she caught sight of herself in the polished metal surface. She looked older than she had just yesterday, the stress already etching lines around her eyes. But she also looked determined. For the first time since the meeting at the Pentagon, Sarah felt like herself again. She was a fighter. It was time to prove it. The preliminary hearing took place in a sterile courtroom at Naval Station Norfolk, the smell of industrial disinfectant mixing with the tension that seemed to radiate from every surface. Sarah sat at the defense table in her dress blue uniform, the weight of her ribbons and decorations feeling heavier than usual. Across the aisle, the prosecution team, led by Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Brennan, arranged their files with military precision. Behind Sarah, the gallery was packed with reporters, military personnel, and supporters. She could feel their eyes on her back like physical pressure. In the front row, her parents sat ramrod straight, her father's weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. Maria had stayed home with the children, but she'd sent a handwritten note that morning. Show them what Martinez women are made of. The presiding officer, Captain Robert Hayes, was a career judge advocate with 30 years of military justice experience. His reputation was one of fairness, but also of strict adherence to military law. Sarah had researched him extensively and found no indication of how he might rule on the unique circumstances of her case. This preliminary hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with a general court-martial, Captain Hayes announced. The government has the burden of proof. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan stood to address the court. She was younger than Sarah had expected, perhaps 35, with the kind of crisp professionalism that suggested rapid advancement through the JAG Corps. Her opening statement was clinical and devastating. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez deliberately employed torture against a detained enemy combatant in direct violation of the Geneva Convention, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and standing orders regarding the treatment of prisoners." Brennan outlined the prosecution's case with surgical precision. Video evidence of the interrogation. Medical testimony about the psychological and physical effects of waterboarding. Expert witnesses who would testify that alternative interrogation methods were available and could have been effective. The defendant will claim that her actions were justified by exceptional circumstances, Brennan continued. But the law does not recognize a necessity defense for torture. The prohibition against cruel and inhuman treatment is absolute, without exception for tactical convenience or emotional pressure. Sarah felt each word like a physical blow. Brennan was painting her as a rogue operator who had lost control, someone who had chosen the easy path of violence over the difficult work of professional interrogation. When Brennan finished, Rebecca Chun rose for the defense. She moved with quiet confidence to the center of the courtroom, making eye contact with Captain Hayes before beginning to speak. "Your Honor, this case is about impossible choices made in impossible circumstances by a decorated officer who had minutes, not hours or days, to save American lives." Chen's approach was different from Brennan's clinical recitation. She spoke with passion about the realities of combat, about the split-second decisions that defined the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Lieutenant Commander Martinez had 15 American lives hanging in the balance, including a teammate who was being systematically tortured for classified information. She had an enemy combatant who possessed critical intelligence, and who was proud of his role in that torture. Sarah found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by Chen's narrative despite knowing the facts better than anyone. The prosecution wants you to believe that torture is never justified under any circumstances. But they weren't there that night. They didn't hear Staff Sergeant Rodriguez screaming. They didn't see the tactical situation deteriorating by the minute. They didn't have to make the choice between theoretical moral purity and actual human lives. Chen paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Lieutenant Commander Martinez made the only choice a reasonable person could make in that situation. She chose to save lives. And for that choice, the government wants to destroy her career and send her to prison. The first witness for the prosecution was Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychologist who specialized in the effects of torture. She testified via video link from her office at Johns Hopkins University, her credentials impressive and her demeanor unshakable. Waterboarding is a form of torture that creates the sensation of drowning, Dr. Foster explained. It causes immediate panic, often leading to lasting psychological trauma. There is no ambiguity about its classification under international law. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan walked Dr. Foster through a detailed explanation of the physical and psychological effects of waterboarding, building a foundation for arguing that Sarah's actions constituted torture by any reasonable definition. Doctor, in your professional opinion, are there alternative interrogation methods that could have been effective in the scenario described? Brennan asked. Absolutely. Sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, psychological pressure techniques. All of these methods are more effective than torture and don't violate international law. On cross-examination, Chun challenged Dr. Foster's testimony with pointed questions about timing and tactical realities. Doctor, these alternative methods you described, how long do they typically take to produce results? That depends on the subject's resistance and the skill of the interrogator. Generally speaking, several hours to several days. Several hours to several days, Chen repeated. And if the interrogator only had minutes to extract life-saving information? Dr. Foster's composure slipped slightly. There are no circumstances that justify torture. That wasn't my question, Doctor. My question was about effectiveness under extreme time constraints. I cannot endorse torture under any circumstances. Chun pressed forward. But you can't deny that extreme time pressure changes the tactical calculus, can you? Objection, Brennan called out. The witness has answered. Sustained, Captain Hayes ruled. The next witness was Agent Thompson from Internal Affairs, who testified about the investigation that had led to the charges. He spoke about the video evidence, the witness statements, and the physical evidence collected from a Syrian compound. The defendant made no effort to conceal her actions, Thompson testified. The interrogation was conducted in full view of surveillance cameras. She appeared to be completely confident that her methods were appropriate. Chen's cross-examination focused on the context Thompson had ignored in his investigation. Agent Thompson, did your investigation include any analysis of the tactical situation Lieutenant Commander Martinez was facing? We reviewed the mission parameters and timeline, yes. Did you interview the rescued hostages about their condition and the immediacy of the threat they faced? Thompson hesitated. We conducted limited interviews. The hostages were traumatized and not reliable witnesses to tactical details. Did you consult with special operations experts about the decision-making process in high-stress combat situations? That was outside the scope of our investigation. Chun let that admission hang in the air before continuing. So your investigation focused exclusively on the interrogation itself, without regard to the circumstances that necessitated it? We investigated the alleged crimes, yes. The alleged crimes, but not the alleged justifications. Torture is never justified, Thompson replied, echoing Dr. Foster's earlier statement. Chun turned to Captain Hayes. Your Honor, I move to strike that statement as argumentative and outside the witness's expertise. Sustained. The jury will disregard the witness's last statement. The prosecution's final witness was the one Sarah had been dreading most, Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez. He entered the courtroom in his dress uniform, looking thinner than Sarah remembered and moving with the careful deliberation of someone on medication. His eyes avoided Sarah's as he was sworn in. Rodriguez's testimony was brief and devastating. He confirmed the basic facts of his capture and torture, his voice barely above a whisper as he described what the enemy combatants had done to him. I could hear them talking about the other Americans they were holding Rodriguez testified. They said they were going to kill all of them at sunrise as an example. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's questioning was gentle but thorough. She established that Rodriguez had been tortured for approximately 18 hours, that he had revealed no classified information despite the treatment, and that the enemy combatants had been planning to execute both him and the hostages. Staff Sergeant, did you observe any part of Lieutenant Commander Martinez's interrogation of the enemy prisoner? No, ma'am. I was unconscious when they rescued me. But you were aware that an interrogation had taken place? Yes, ma'am. The team told me afterward. And what was your reaction to learning about the methods used? Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his hands trembling slightly. Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. I was grateful, he said finally. She saved my life. Brennan pressed forward. But, regardless of your personal gratitude, do you believe torture is ever acceptable? Chun stood immediately. Objection. The witness is not qualified to render legal opinions. Sustained. On cross-examination, Chun treated Rodriguez with obvious care, her questions designed to elicit his perspective without re-traumatizing him. Staff Sergeant, you've known Lieutenant Commander Martinez for how long? About 3 years, ma'am. She was my team leader for 2 deployments. In your experience, is she someone who employs violence casually or unnecessarily? No, ma'am. Never. She always looked for alternatives first. Did you ever see her lose her temper or act irrationally under pressure? Never. She was always calm, always thinking tactically. Chin paused before asking her final question. Staff Sergeant, if you had been in Lieutenant Commander Martinez's position that night, with 15 American lives at stake and minutes to extract critical information, what would you have done? Rodriguez looked directly at Sarah for the first time since entering the courtroom. I would have done the same thing, he said quietly. I would have done whatever it took to save my team. The prosecution rested their case with a video presentation of the interrogation footage. Sarah watched herself on the small monitor, seeing the scene from an outsider's perspective for the first time. The clinical detachment she'd felt during the actual interrogation was invisible on screen. To an observer, it looked like calculated brutality. The footage showed Hassan strapped to a board, a towel over his face, Sarah pouring water in a steady stream. The enemy combatants' muffled screams and desperate struggling were clearly audible. Between sessions, Sarah could be seen asking questions in Arabic, her voice steady and professional even as Hassan writhed in panic. The video was devastating, and Sarah knew it. Without context, without understanding the pressure she'd been under or the lives at stake, her actions looked indefensible. Chun began the defense case with character witnesses. Master Chief Sullivan testified about Sarah's leadership and moral character, describing incidents where she had risked her own safety to protect civilian lives. Colonel Martinez took the stand to speak about his daughter's integrity and dedication to service. Sarah has always held herself to the highest standards, Colonel Martinez testified. If she used extreme methods, it was because she had no other choice. The defense's expert witness was Dr. James Morrison, a former Army psychologist who had spent 20 years studying decision-making under extreme stress. His testimony focused on the cognitive effects of combat pressure and the split-second judgments required in special operations. Lieutenant Commander Martinez was operating in what we call a ticking time bomb scenario, Dr. Morrison explained. Multiple lives at immediate risk, limited information, extreme time pressure. Under these conditions, normal decision-making processes become compressed. Doctor, in your professional opinion, could a reasonable person in Lieutenant Commander Martinez's position have concluded that waterboarding was necessary? Chen asked. Based on the tactical situation and the information available to her at the time, yes. It was a reasonable conclusion under extraordinary circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's cross-examination was aggressive, focusing on Dr. Morrison's history of supporting enhanced interrogation techniques in academic papers. Doctor, you've written extensively defending coercive interrogation methods, haven't you? I've written about the psychological realities of information extraction under time pressure, yes. And you've been criticized by colleagues for advocating torture? Dr. Morrison's jaw tightened. I've been criticized for acknowledging uncomfortable realities about extreme situations. Sarah's own testimony was the centerpiece of the defense case. Chun had prepared her extensively, but nothing could fully prepare her for the experience of defending her actions under hostile questioning. Commander Martinez, did you enjoy waterboarding the enemy combatant? Lieutenant Colonel Brennan asked during cross-examination. No, I did not. Did you consider it a last resort? Yes. Were you aware that waterboarding is considered torture under international law? Sarah hesitated, knowing that her answer could determine the outcome of the case. I was aware that it was controversial, but I was also aware that 15 American lives were at stake. That's not what I asked. Were you aware that it constitutes torture? I was aware of the legal classification, yes. Brennan pounced on the admission. So you knowingly chose to commit torture? Chun stood. Objection. Argumentative. Overruled. The witness will answer. Sarah looked directly at Captain Hayes. I chose to save American lives using the most effective means available under extreme time constraints. By torturing a prisoner. By extracting information that saved 15 lives. The exchange continued for over an hour, Brennan systematically attacking every aspect of Sarah's decision-making process. Sarah held her ground, but she could feel the weight of the legal system pressing down on her. During redirect, Chun gave Sarah the opportunity to explain her perspective in her own words. Commander Martinez, if you found yourself in the exact same situation tomorrow, would you make the same choice? Sarah thought about Rodriguez, about the 12 rescued hostages who had returned to their families, about the moral complexity of a decision that couldn't be reduced to simple legal categories. Yes, she said firmly. I would make the same choice. The closing arguments took place on a gray Friday afternoon, with rain pattering against the courtroom windows. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan spoke first. Her argument focused on the absolute nature of the prohibition against torture. This case is not about the defendant's intentions or the difficulty of her situation, Brennan argued. It's about the rule of law and the principle that some lines cannot be crossed, regardless of circumstances. She reminded Captain Hayes that military discipline depended on clear standards and consistent enforcement. If we excuse torture in this case because of exceptional circumstances, we open the door to abuse in future operations. The law must be absolute to be meaningful. Chen's closing argument was passionate and personal, focusing on the human cost of rigid legal interpretations applied to extreme situations. Lieutenant Commander Martinez is not on trial for being a war criminal, Chen argued. She's on trial for making an impossible choice in an impossible situation, for choosing to save lives rather than preserve legal purity. Chun painted a picture of Sarah as a dedicated officer who had sacrificed everything for her country, only to be prosecuted for actions that had saved American lives. The prosecution wants you to believe that moral courage means following rules regardless of consequences. But real moral courage means taking responsibility for the outcomes of your actions. Lieutenant Commander Martinez showed that courage. She made a choice that saved 15 lives, knowing it might destroy her career. As Chen finished her argument, Sarah felt a mixture of pride and terror. Her fate was now in the hands of Captain Hayes, a man she'd never met who would decide whether she was a hero or a criminal. Captain Hayes recessed the court for deliberation, and Sarah found herself in the courthouse break room with her family and legal team. The waiting was excruciating, each minute feeling like an hour. How long do these things usually take? Maria asked, her nervous energy filling the small space. Could be hours, could be days, Chen replied. There's no way to predict. Sarah's father sat quietly in the corner, his military bearing intact despite the stress. Sarah knew he was thinking about his own career, about the difficult decisions he'd made in Vietnam and later in Iraq. They'd never talked about those experiences in detail, but Sarah understood now that her father carried his own burden of moral complexity. Dad, Sarah said quietly, do you think I did the right thing? Colonel Martinez looked at his daughter with eyes that had seen too much war and too many impossible choices. I think you did what you had to do, he said, and I think you'll live with it better than you would have lived with letting those people die. 3 hours later, Captain Hayes returned to the courtroom. His expression was unreadable as he took his seat and reviewed his notes. After careful consideration of the evidence and testimony presented, this court finds that sufficient evidence exists to proceed with a general court-martial on charges of violation of the Geneva Convention and conduct unbecoming an officer. Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. She was going to trial. However, Captain Hayes continued, the court also finds that the evidence supports a reasonable belief that the defendant acted under extraordinary duress to prevent imminent harm to American personnel. Therefore, This court recommends that the convening authority consider these exceptional circumstances when determining the appropriate forum for trial. It was a split decision, neither vindication nor condemnation. Sarah would face court-martial, but with official recognition that her situation had been extraordinary. As the court adjourned, Sarah felt numb. The legal battle was far from over, but at least she would have the opportunity to present a full defense. "What does this mean?" she asked Chun as they gathered their materials. "It means we go to trial," Chun replied, "but it also means the judge thinks you had good reason for what you did. That's something we can work with." Outside the courthouse, reporters waited like sharks, sensing blood in the water. Sarah walked through their questions without stopping, her family forming a protective circle around her. "Commander Martinez, do you have any regrets?" one reporter shouted. Sarah paused at the car door, looking back at the courthouse where her fate had been partially decided. "My only regret," she said loudly enough for the microphones to pick up, "is that we live in a world where sometimes good people have to make terrible choices." As they drove away from Norfolk, Sarah stared out the window at the Virginia landscape, thinking about the trial ahead. The preliminary hearing had been just the beginning. The real fight was yet to come. But for the first time since this ordeal had started, Sarah felt ready for that fight. She had faced the system's best legal minds and held her ground. She had told her story and been heard. Now she just had to prove that sometimes doing the right thing required breaking the rules. The court-martial was scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. 6 weeks to prepare for the fight of her life. Sarah Martinez had always been good at preparing for fights. The court-martial began on a Monday morning in January, with snow falling steadily outside the military courthouse at Naval Station Norfolk. Sarah sat at the defense table in her dress blue uniform, the same ribbons and decorations that had once represented honor, now feeling like targets painted on her chest. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow spectators watching on closed-circuit television in an adjacent room. The members of the court-martial panel, 5 senior military officers who would serve as both judge and jury, entered in dress uniform. Sarah studied their faces, looking for any hint of sympathy or prejudgment. 2 Navy captains, 1 Marine colonel, 1 Army lieutenant colonel, and 1 Air Force colonel. All combat veterans, all career officers who understood the realities of military service. The panel president was Captain Elizabeth Morgan, a surface warfare officer with 28 years of service. Sarah had researched her background extensively. 2 combat deployments, a reputation for fairness, and a daughter currently serving as a Navy pilot. If anyone on the panel might understand the pressures of military leadership, it would be Captain Morgan. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan stood to deliver the prosecution's opening statement. She had refined her argument since the preliminary hearing, focusing more on the precedent that would be set if Sarah were acquitted. Members of the panel, this case is about more than one officer's actions on one night in Syria. It's about the fundamental principles that distinguish professional military forces from criminal organizations. Brennan painted a picture of military discipline as a fragile construct that required absolute adherence to legal and moral standards. The defendant will ask you to excuse torture because it achieved a tactical objective. But if we accept that argument, we accept that the ends justify the means, regardless of how brutal those means might be. She walked the panel through the evidence methodically. The video footage of the waterboarding, expert testimony about the psychological effects of torture, the existence of alternative interrogation methods that could have been employed. The defendant is a decorated officer with an exemplary record. But that record makes her actions more troubling, not less. If an officer of her experience and training can rationalize torture, what message does that send to junior personnel? Brennan's argument was clinical and effective, rooted in legal precedent and military regulation. She avoided emotional appeals, instead building a logical case that Sarah's actions, regardless of their motivation, constituted clear violations of military law. When Brennan finished, Rebecca Chun rose for the defense. Her approach was markedly different, beginning not with law, but with humanity. Members of the panel, I want you to imagine the worst possible day of your military career. The day when all your training, all your experience, all your moral certainties collide with an impossible reality. Chun described the tactical situation Sarah had faced, using the courtroom itself as a visual aid to help the panel understand the geography of the compound and the time pressures involved. Lieutenant Commander Martinez had 15 American lives in her hands and minutes to save them. She had an enemy combatant who was bragging about torturing an American soldier who possessed information that could save those lives. Unlike Brennan's clinical presentation, Chen's argument was visceral and immediate. She wanted the panel to feel the pressure Sarah had experienced, to understand that abstract legal principles offered little guidance in extreme circumstances. The prosecution wants you to believe that military discipline requires blind adherence to rules regardless of consequences. But real military discipline requires officers to accomplish their mission and take care of their people. That's exactly what Lieutenant Commander Martinez did. The prosecution's case began with the video evidence, projected on a large screen for the panel to see. Sarah forced herself to watch as her actions played out in stark detail. The enemy combatant strapped to the board, the towel over his face, the water being poured in steady streams. The muffled screams and desperate struggling were clearly audible in the silent courtroom. The footage was even more damaging than Sarah had remembered. Without the context of the tactical situation, without the sound of Rodriguez's screams or the knowledge that hostages were scheduled for execution, her actions appeared coldly calculated and unnecessarily brutal. Dr. Amanda Foster returned as the prosecution's expert witness on torture, her testimony delivered via video link with crisp professional authority. This time, her presentation was more detailed, including graphic descriptions of the psychological and physiological effects of waterboarding. The subject experiences the sensation of drowning, Dr. Foster explained. The mammalian diving reflex is triggered, causing immediate panic and loss of rational thought. This creates a state of learned helplessness that can persist long after the torture ends. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan used Dr. Foster's testimony to establish that waterboarding was unambiguously torture under any reasonable definition, and that its effects were both immediate and lasting. Doctor, in your professional opinion, would the subject retain the ability to provide accurate information while undergoing this procedure? Actually, no. The panic response interferes with cognitive function. Subjects are more likely to say anything to make the torture stop, regardless of its accuracy. This was a crucial point for the prosecution's case. If waterboarding was not only illegal, but also ineffective, Sarah's justification based on tactical necessity became much weaker. Chen's cross-examination focused on the specific circumstances of Sarah's case rather than waterboarding in general. Doctor, your expertise is in the general effects of waterboarding. You weren't present during Lieutenant Commander Martinez's interrogation, were you? No, I was not. So you can't testify about the specific effectiveness of her methods in that particular situation? I can testify about the general principles. That wasn't my question, Doctor. Can you testify about what actually happened during that specific interrogation? Dr. Foster's composure slipped slightly. No, I cannot. The prosecution's next witness was Agent Thompson, whose testimony about the internal affairs investigation was more detailed than it had been at the preliminary hearing. He presented evidence of Sarah's awareness of legal restrictions on interrogation methods, including training records that showed she had been specifically instructed about the prohibition against waterboarding. The defendant received 40 hours of training on lawful interrogation techniques, Thompson testified. This training included specific instruction that waterboarding is prohibited under the Geneva Convention and U.S. military law. Brennan used Thompson's testimony to establish that Sarah had acted knowingly in violation of clear legal standards, undermining any defense based on ignorance or confusion about the law. On cross-examination, Chen challenged Thompson's investigation as incomplete and biased. Agent Thompson, did your investigation include any consultation with special operations experts about decision-making under extreme combat stress? We consulted with interrogation experts. That's not what I asked. Did you consult with experts on combat decision-making? No, we did not consider that relevant to our investigation. Chen pressed further. Did you interview any of the rescued hostages about their condition or the immediacy of the threat they faced? Brief interviews, yes, but they were traumatized and not reliable sources of tactical information. So you determined they were unreliable without conducting thorough interviews? Thompson's jaw tightened. We determined that their emotional state made them unsuitable for detailed questioning about tactical matters. In other words, you chose not to gather evidence that might have supported the defendant's justification for her actions. We gathered evidence relevant to the crimes under investigation, Thompson replied. The prosecution's final witness was once again Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, but This time his testimony was different. Over the months since the preliminary hearing, the pressure from internal affairs had intensified, and Rodriguez appeared more fragile and conflicted than before. Rodriguez testified about his capture and torture in greater detail, describing the systematic brutality he had endured. His voice trembled as he recounted being waterboarded, beaten, and subjected to psychological torture over an 18-hour period. They kept asking about base locations, mission parameters, team composition, Rodriguez said. I try not to tell them anything, but after a while, I wasn't sure what I might have said. This admission was significant for the prosecution's case. If Rodriguez had revealed classified information under torture, it raised questions about the effectiveness of resistance training and the urgency of extracting him from enemy custody. Staff Sergeant, during your captivity, did you hear any discussions about the fate of the other American hostages? Brennan asked. Yes, ma'am. They said they were going to execute all of them at dawn, as an example. They were excited about it, talking about making videos to send to American news outlets. Brennan established through Rodriguez's testimony that the threat to the hostages had been real and immediate, but then used that fact to argue that proper military procedure should have been followed regardless of time pressure. Staff Sergeant, in your training as a special operations soldier, were you taught that torture is acceptable under any circumstances? Rodriguez looked directly at Sarah before answering. No, ma'am. We were taught that torture is illegal and ineffective. And regardless of your personal gratitude to Lieutenant Commander Martinez, do you believe the military should adhere to those standards? Rodriguez's internal struggle was visible on his face. Sarah could see him wrestling with loyalty to her versus pressure from the investigation. I believe the military should follow its own rules, he said quietly. Chen's cross-examination was gentle but probing, designed to elicit Rodriguez's true feelings about Sarah's actions without causing him additional trauma. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you've served under Lieutenant Commander Martinez for 3 years. In that time, have you ever seen her?